Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a truly pivotal period of history. Adam Smith, back in 1776, in The Wealth of Nations, he famously declared that the discovery of America was one of the two greatest events ever.
Right, a huge claim.
Huge. But our sources, like Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, they immediately push back on that word, discovery. I mean, millions of people already lived here, thriving societies, complex cultures for thousands of years. So what was really being discovered and by whom?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Yep.
And it fundamentally reframes how we look at this. Our mission today, really, is to try and understand that vibrant ancient world before Columbus showed up.
And then the interactions that followed.
Exactly. The complex, often devastating interactions, and how all of that laid the groundwork for, well, everything that came after in American history. We're digging into Chapter 1 of Foner's text, A New World, to get a handle on these foundational shifts.
Okay, so we'll be looking at the incredible diversity of Native American life first, then those clashing ideas about what freedom even meant.
Big one, that.
Yeah, and European motivations for heading west, the consequences often catastrophic of contact, and, how the Spanish, French, and Dutch empires differed in their approaches.
The core idea, you see, is that the events kicked off in 1492 sparked these massive transformative changes. Not just in the Americas, but back in Europe, too.
Reshaping everything, diets, environments, populations.
Absolutely. Societal structures across the globe. It's a moment that fundamentally reset the human story, and we're still feeling its echoes today.
So let's unpack this new world. Where do we start? Before the Europeans arrive.
Definitely. We have to understand this wasn't a new world at all. It was an ancient homeland. The people living here were descendants of hunters and fishers who crossed the Bering Strait land bridge, we think, somewhere between 15,000 and maybe even 60,000 years ago.
Wow, that's a vast time frame.
It is, and the key takeaway, I think, is the sheer diversity. Native Americans weren't one single group. Hundreds of languages, countless different societies, political systems, religions. It was incredibly varied.
And not just small bands wandering around, right? The sources talk about major civilizations.
Oh, absolutely, especially once agriculture took root, around 9,000 years ago in places like modern-day Mexico and the Andes. That happened around the same time as in the Near East, interestingly.
Which allowed for settled societies.
Exactly. And some were huge. Think of the Aztec Empire, their capital, Tenochtitlan, in Mexico. Foner describes it as one of the world's largest cities, maybe 250,000 people.
250,000 people.
Yeah, with complex cities, roads, irrigation, big trade networks, pyramid temples, canals, bridges, sophisticated urban planning. And the Inca kingdom down in Peru, maybe 12 million people connected by this incredible 2,000-mile road system.
So much for an empty wilderness.
Precisely. That narrative just doesn't hold up. Now, moving north into what's now the U.S., the societies were different, generally lacking things like European metal tools or gunpowder.
Which Europeans later used as justification for conquest, right? This
Yeah.
idea of them being backward.
They absolutely did. But it totally overlooks some remarkable achievements, like the mound builders. Poverty Point in Louisiana, 3,500 years ago, a massive governmental and commercial center.
Okay.
And Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, flourished about 1,000 years before Columbus. A fortified city, maybe 10,000 to 30,000 people. It was the largest settled community in what's now the U.S. until around 1800.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Until 1800.
Yeah. Or out west, the Hopi and Zuni in Arizona, building planned towns and canyons for over 3,000 years. Pueblo Bonita in Chaco Canyon, 5 stories, 600 rooms, nothing bigger built in the U.S. until the 1880s. They had sophisticated water management, dams, canals.
These examples really do challenge that whole primitive stereotype.
Fundamentally. And in the East, you had hundreds of tribes living on corn, squash, beans, hunting, fishing, complex trade routes, diplomacy, even confederations like the Iroquois Great League of Peace.
So across this vast diversity, were there any common threads in how these societies viewed the world, like religion or land?
Good question. Religion was central. Life was steeped in ceremonies, often tied to farming and hunting. A common belief in sacred spirits inhabiting all living things, nature itself. Shamans and medicine men held great respect.
But Europeans saw that differently.
Completely. They saw it as paganism, devil worship even. They couldn't grasp the idea of nature being sacred rather than a commodity to be exploited. And land, that was another huge difference.
How so?
For Native Americans, land was generally seen as a common resource, not something you could buy or sell like a product. Families might have rights to use plots of land for a season, tribes claimed hunting grounds, but there wasn't a real estate market.
Very different from the European concept of private property.
Absolutely. And wealth, too. Status often came from generosity, sharing, gift-giving, not hoarding material goods.
And gender roles. The source mentions matrilineal societies.
Yes, in many societies, kinship flowed through the mother's line. Women often owned dwellings and tools, controlled agriculture. They generally had more independence than European women, including premarital sexual freedom, ability to divorce.
Which Europeans probably found shocking or uncivilized.
Exactly. European men saw Indian men hunting as leisure, not real work, and women doing farm work as a sign of oppression, of their lack of freedom. They basically saw Indian life through their own biased lens, judging their religion, their land use, their gender roles as inherently inferior, barbaric even.
Which brings us back to that idea of freedom. How did these vastly different concepts clash?
Well, as we said, for Native Americans, freedom was about the community, kinship, spiritual connection, group well-being, autonomy for the group, mutual obligations. Individual liberty or owning property wasn't the main focus.
It's ironic then that Europeans arrived talking so much about liberty.
Deeply ironic. And as Native Americans faced conquest independence, the idea of freedom, often defined in opposition to European control, became a central preoccupation for them too.
So what about European freedom? What did that look like back then?
It was complicated and very hierarchical, not a single universal right, but more like a collection of specific rights and privileges enjoyed by only a few. Society was rigid.
Like Christian liberty.
Right, that was a spiritual concept, freeing yourself from sin by embracing Christ. But it had zero connection to religious toleration. Every European nation had an official church, and they actively persecuted dissenters. Freedom often meant obedience to the law, to the king, to the husband.
You mentioned coverture earlier.
Yes, a key legal doctrine. When a woman married, her legal identity essentially vanished. She couldn't own property in her own name, sign contracts, control her own wages. It's a stark contrast to the status of women in many Native societies.
And even for men, freedom was limited, right? Economic independence was rare, voting restricted by property.
Exactly. Liberties were often specific, granted privileges like a town's right to self-government or trading rights. Governments actively suppressed criticism. Yet somehow, the colonizers genuinely believed they were bringing freedom to the Indians.
It's a massive disconnect. So what actually pushed these Europeans to venture across the Atlantic? We mentioned Adam Smith's other great event.
Right, the Portuguese finding a sea route to Asia. That was driven by profit, wanting those silks and spices without going through Islamic middlemen or the Italian city-states, and also piety, this idea of spreading Christianity.
And China could have been first.
That's fascinating. Admiral Zheng, he led these enormous Chinese fleets into the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433, way bigger than anything Europe had. They could have reached the Americas. But China was a powerful, wealthy, land-based empire. They just decided long-distance sea exploration wasn't worth the effort after 1433.
Wow. A major turning point. So Portugal steps in.
Yeah, Portugal was geographically positioned for Atlantic exploration. They developed new ships, caravels, better navigation tools, sailed down the African coast, setting up fortified trading posts or factories.
And this is where the link to slavery really strengthened.
Unfortunately, yes. On the Atlantic islands, they colonized Madeira. The Azores, they established sugar plantations using thousands of African slaves. This became a grim model for the New World.
And this wasn't the same as slavery within Africa before Europeans arrived.
No, traditional African slavery was different. Often war captives, criminals, debtors. They usually had some rights, could sometimes own property, even gain freedom. It wasn't the brutal race-based chattel slavery system that developed across the Atlantic, but the Portuguese arrival definitely accelerated the trade in slaves within Africa. By 1500, maybe 100,000 Africans had been transported to Spain and Portugal.
Setting a terrible stage. And then comes Columbus.
Christopher Columbus, a seasoned Italian sailor, convinced he could reach Asia by sailing west. He knew the world was round, but he drastically underestimated its size. Didn't realize 2 whole continents were in the way.
What drove him?
A mix of things. Religious fervor, wanting to convert Asians, maybe even fund a crusade. And commerce, definitely, finding that direct route to Asian riches.
And Spain was ready to listen.
Perfect timing.
The
King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just finished the Reconquista in 1492, driving out the Moors. They were eager to break into that Asian trade and bypass the Portuguese and Muslims, so they funded Columbus's voyage.
And in 1492,
He lands in the Bahamas, encounters Hispaniola, Cuba, takes some inhabitants back to Spain as proof. His first settlement fails, but by 1502, a permanent Spanish base is established on Hispaniola. the beginning of the Spanish Empire in America.
And the name America?
Comes from another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. His voyages made it clear this wasn't Asia, but a whole new world. Columbus actually died still believing he'd reached the East Indies, hence Indians.
Wild. And news spread fast.
Thanks to Gutenberg's printing press,
Yeah.
news of Columbus's voyage went, well, viral for the time. It inspired others. Spain really led the charge initially, the conquistadors. Driven by wealth, national glory, spreading Catholicism, Balboa reaches the Pacific. Magellan's cruise circles the globe.
And then the conquests of the major empires, Cortez and the Aztecs.
Right, 1519. Cortez takes Tenochtitlan. He was shrewd, exploited existing rivalries, allied with groups resentful of Aztec rule, had superior iron weapons, gunpowder.
But the source emphasizes something else even more powerful.
Disease. Smallpox, specifically. It ravaged Aztec society, weakened them immensely. That was maybe Cortez's most powerful ally. Pizarro used similar tactics, plus outright treachery, to conquer the Incas in Peru. Huge amounts of gold and silver flowed back to Spain.
This brings us to the Columbian Exchange you mentioned.
Yes, this massive transatlantic flow, goods moving both ways. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, peanuts from the New World to the Old.
Changed European diets forever.
Absolutely. And wheat, rice, sugarcane, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, going from the Old World to the New.
Also transformative. But the devastating part?
The diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles. Native Americans had no immunity. They'd been isolated for millennia. The impact was catastrophic.
That's how bad was it?
The numbers are staggering, almost unimaginable. Estimates are maybe 50 to 90 million people in the Americas before Columbus. In Mexico alone, the population might have dropped from 20 million to less than 2 million in the 16th century. That's over 90% loss.
90%?
Overall, maybe 80 million deaths across the Americas in the first 150 years. Close to a fifth of the entire human population at the time. It's the greatest loss of life in human history. Disease was just as important as military power, maybe more so, in enabling European conquest.
It's hard to even comprehend that scale, so Spain builds this massive empire on top of this devastation.
A vast empire stretching from Europe to the Americas, even parts of Asia. Bigger than the Roman Empire. Mexico City, built right on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, became this grand capital, churches, hospitals, universities. More impressive than early English settlements or many European cities at the time.
How is it governed?
Top down. Authority flowed from the king in Spain through the Council of the Indies down to viceroys in America. The Catholic Church was deeply involved in administration. No elected assemblies like in later British colonies. Officials were mostly Spaniards, not Criollos, people of European descent born in the colonies.
And the relationship with the native population? Labor.
Primarily forced Indian labor. In the gold and silver mines on the large farms called haciendas. Because the native population was so large, Spain didn't rely on importing African slaves as heavily as other empires did, except in the Caribbean.
But Spanish colonists came too.
Yes, about 750,000 over 3 centuries. Initially, mostly young, single men hoping to improve their social standing. And because Indian populations always outnumbered Europeans and the crown didn't discourage it, there was significant intermarriage.
Leading to the mestizo population?
Exactly. People of mixed Spanish and Indian origin. By 1600, they were a large part of the population. Spanish America became this hybrid culture. Spanish, Indian, eventually African elements too, but all under a single official faith, language, and government structure.
How did Spain justify all this conquest and exploitation?
Well, partly this deep-seated belief in their own cultural superiority. They just expected natives to abandon their ways. And religious zeal was huge. Remember the Reconquista. They saw converting millions of Indians to Catholicism as a divine mission, especially after the Protestant Reformation started in Europe. Spain saw itself as the defender of the true faith.
But wasn't there criticism from within? Las Casas?
Yes, Bartolomé de Las Casas, a Dominican priest who had participated in the conquest but had a change of heart. He wrote powerfully, like a very brief account of the destruction of the Indies, denouncing the horrific cruelty and the massive death toll. He argued that all people were human, deserving liberty and justice.
Did his arguments have any effect?
Some. His work, along with other factors, led to the new laws in 1542, which technically ended Indian slavery. And the encomienda system, where settlers got land and forced labor rights, was abolished in 1550. It was replaced by the repartimiento system.
Was that much better?
Well, Indians were legally free, entitled to wages, had access to land, but they were still required to perform a fixed amount of labor each year. So abuses definitely continued. Las Casas' writings also, ironically, contributed to the Black legend,
The Black Legend.
Yeah, his vivid accounts of Spanish atrocities were translated and spread across Europe by Spain's rivals, like the English and Dutch. They used it to paint Spain as uniquely cruel and barbaric, justifying their own attempts to colonize and challenge Spanish power.
So Spain expands northwards, too, into present-day U.S. territory.
They do. Puerto Rico first in 1508, then Florida, Ponce de Leon looking for gold, maybe the Fountain of Youth. Hernando de Soto rampaged through the southeast. Coronado explored the southwest, mostly fruitless searches for gold, but they spread disease and devastation wherever they went.
De Soto was particularly brutal, the source says.
Extremely. Spain established St. Augustine in Florida in 1565, mainly as a military base against pirates and the French. It's the oldest continuous European settlement in the U.S., but it remained pretty isolated.
And New Mexico.
Juan de Oñate led settlers there in 1598. The Acoma massacre happened shortly after hundreds killed, brutal punishments. Oñate himself was later punished for it. Santa Fe became the capital in 1610. But relations were tense.
Leading to the Pueblo Revolt.
Exactly, in 1680. Decades of exploitation, forced labor, and really aggressive attempts by Franciscan friars to stamp out traditional Pueblo religion, often using violence. It all boiled over.
How did it unfold?
A Pueblo religious leader named Pope managed to unite the diverse Pueblo peoples, remarkably. They used Spanish, the language of their colonizers, as a common language to coordinate. They rose up together, destroyed missions, killed about 400 colonists and 21 priests, and drove the Spanish completely out of New Mexico.
That sounds like a major event.
It was huge, the most complete victory for Native Americans over European colonizers in North American history. The only time settlers were completely expelled. Now, Pueblo unity didn't last, and the Spanish did reconquer New Mexico about 12 years later, in 1692.
But things changed.
Yes. The Spanish learned a lesson. They became more tolerant of indigenous religious practices, made fewer demands for forced labor. It marked a shift in Spanish colonial policy in that region.
Okay, so while Spain established this huge, complex empire, other Europeans were watching, right? The French and Dutch.
Definitely. Spain's wealth was a huge motivator. Global trade focus shifted towards the Atlantic. So France gets involved. Samuel de Champlain founds Quebec in 1608. French explorers map the Mississippi Valley, claiming a vast territory, New France.
But not many French people actually came.
Very few, relatively speaking, only about 19,000 white inhabitants by 1700. The French government actually worried that sending too many people overseas would weaken France and Europe. Plus, Canada had a reputation cold, savage Indians. And importantly, French Protestants, the Huguenots, weren't allowed to settle. The Crown wanted a Catholic colony.
How were their relations with Native Americans, different from the Spanish?
Generally, yes. Because their main focus was the fur trade. Not large-scale farming or mining, they depended on good relations with native groups. They formed more enduring alliances than other colonial powers. Jesuit missionaries tried to convert Indians, but often allowed them more cultural independence.
And intermarriage?
Yes, leading to the métis population, children of Frenchmen and Indian women. They often became crucial intermediaries, guides, traders, interpreters. The French model was more about partnership, relatively speaking, though still driven by French interests.
Okay, now the Dutch. New Netherland.
Right. Henry Hudson, an Englishman working for the Dutch, sails into New York Harbor in 1609, finds furs, willing traders. The Dutch West India Company sets up a settlement on Manhattan Island in 1624. This is during the Dutch Golden Age. They're dominating international commerce.
And they had a reputation for freedom back home.
They did. Amsterdam was known for freedom of the press, religious tolerance, a haven for persecuted groups like Protestants and Jews.
Did that translate to the colony?
To some extent. New Netherland wasn't a democracy. New Amsterdam was basically a fortified company town. But colonists did have certain liberties. Slaves, for instance, could have half freedom, pay a fee, work when called, but have some land. Married women kept their separate legal identity, could do business.
That's quite different from English or Spanish law.
Very different. And New Amsterdam was incredibly diverse from the start. By the 1630s, something like 18 languages spoken there. Dutch, Africans, Belgians, English, French, Germans, Irish, Scandinavians.
What about religious tolerance?
The Dutch Reformed Church was official, but they generally tolerated private worship. The governor, Petrus Stuyvesant, tried to kick out some Jews who arrived, but the company overruled him, partly because Jews had invested in the company. Business often trumped religious intolerance.
But like the French, not many Dutch came over.
No, it remained pretty small. Only about 9,000 Europeans by the mid-1660s. Their main goal was trade, not mass settlement. They tried to purchase land from Indians rather than just seize it, influenced partly by the Black legend about Spain and also by their own history of fighting for independence from Spain. They maintained fairly good relations with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy.
So we have these three distinct European empires interacting with diverse native societies. What about the areas where they overlapped, the borderlands?
Right, these were really interesting zones. Foner calls them meeting places of peoples where geographical and cultural borders are not clearly defined. Power was often fluid, unstable. Native groups could sometimes play empires off against each other, wielding real influence. There was lots of trade, cultural mixing, intermarriage. Things didn't always fit neat imperial boundaries.
But the overall impact, despite the differences between Spain, France, and the Netherlands.
Despite the differences in approach conquest versus trade, attitudes towards conversion, numbers of settlers, all three European powers brought profound, often devastating changes. They introduced Christianity, new technologies, different legal systems, new ideas about family and economy, and crucially, they brought new forms of warfare and diseases that decimated native populations.
Okay, quite a journey through this foundational period. Let's try to pull together the main takeaways from this deep dive into Chapter 1.
Sure. First, the sheer diversity and sophistication of Native American societies before 1492.
Right.
We have to discard that empty continent myth. Second, the fundamental clash of ideas about freedom, communal well-being versus individual rights and property.
Right. Third, European motivations, that potent mix of God, glory, and gold, or maybe profit and piety is a better way to put it. Fourth, the absolutely catastrophic demographic impact of the Columbian Exchange, especially disease.
Can't overstate that one. And finally, the distinct characteristics of the Spanish, French, and Dutch colonial projects, their different goals, settlement patterns, and relationships with native peoples, even as they all irrevocably altered the continent.
It really sets the stage for everything that follows.
Absolutely. And it makes you think, doesn't it? You see moments of exchange, hybrid cultures emerging like the mestizos or métis. What might America look like today if, somehow, those initial encounters had been grounded more in genuine mutual respect and coexistence rather than primarily conquest and conversion?
That's a powerful question to ponder. It really highlights how contingent history can be, how different choices might have led down vastly different paths, something for all of you to think about as you continue exploring American history.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into a new world. We hope it sheds some light on these crucial beginnings. We'll see you next time.